So a few days ago, I was at the public library with my children, and my daughter happened to pull this book off the shelf. I'm holding it up so you can see it. It's a book I'd never seen before, but she asked me to read it to her, so I opened it. It's called The First Rains, and it's a book about an Indian boy named Arjuna, who's waiting for the start of the monsoon season very, very eagerly. And the newspapers say that it's going to start raining any day now, Zayin Cheshvan, but the rains aren't coming. And as the book goes on, I'm not good at holding this up, but the anticipation grows and grows. And then, of course, on the last page, finally, the rains fall. So I thought this was so apt that she had handed me, of all books to pull off the shelf, just as we're about to finish Masechet Taanit. And it happened to also be I think it was the same day Michelle wrote me to ask me to teach, because I sent her a picture. I said, you won't believe it, I'm at the library and look what my daughter just gave me. So Michelle knows this. But anyway, after I was thinking about this, and I said, you know what? You know who would really appreciate this moment? I mean, I'm sure Michelle appreciated it, but Ilfa would really appreciate this moment. Now, why do I say Ilfa? So we all learned this story in Daf Yomi, and I'd like to go back to it tonight with you. It's a story, as y'all recall, that features two characters, Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan. Ilfa is a lesser known figure in the Talmud, doesn't appear all that often. His name comes from the Aramaic word for boat, or perhaps from the Aramaic word for to learn, like yalif. And those two terms really reflect sort of a tension, a polarity in the character of Ilfa. The other figure in our story is Rabbi Yochanan, who is one of the greatest sage in the land of Israel in the 3rd century, rival to Rav and Shmuel in Babylonia at the time. He was the head of a major Beit Midrash in Tiberia. He's quoted on almost every page of the Gemara. And these characters figure in our story, which I would like to, we'll read it together and discuss as we go along. I know you've all seen it before, so I'll read pretty quickly. So I am going to share my screen so you all have the source in front of you, and I have, let's see, all participants. Let's see, okay, let's see if this works. I want to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you all see it now? Yeah? Okay, good, okay. Great, okay, so I'm gonna read, okay. I'm just gonna read in the English, but you can follow along in the original, okay. Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan studied Torah, and as a result, they became very hard-pressed for money. They said, let us get up and go and engage in commerce, and we will fulfill with regard to ourselves the verse, Efes ki lo yeh v'cha evyon. Okay, so we have a story of two scholars who engage in the study of Torah until they become too poor to do it anymore. They've spent all their lives studying Torah and have not concerned themselves with making a living, but now they have a problem. Their lifestyle has become unsustainable. Basically, they're broke. And so they decide that they're going to leave the Beit Midrash and go get jobs. But you may notice something interesting about the way they speak of their decision to leave the world of Torah learning and go find work, right? How do they justify what they're doing? By quoting a pasuk from Dvarim. That is to say, they invoke words of Torah to justify their decision to leave the world of Torah, almost as if the very Torah that they study is what's requiring them to take a break from that study. Reminds me of a statement by Reish Lakish in Masechet Menachot, Reish Lakish being the study partner of Rabbi Yochanan, who said, Ka'amim shebitula shel Torah zehu yisoda. Sometimes you have to nullify or desist from the study of Torah, and that is the very fulfillment of Torah. Sometimes in order to fulfill the dictates of the Torah, you have to stop learning Torah. As a person who has a hard time stopping to learn Torah, I think about that statement a lot. But I think in order to really understand what they're doing, we have to look at the pasuk they're quoting in its context. Okay, this pasuk, Efes ki lo yeh v'cha evyon. It's a pasuk that appears in the beginning of Devarim, as Moshe teaches the people all the laws they're going to have to observe when they enter Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan. The chapter begins with the laws of the Shemitah year. Every 7th year, all debts will be forgiven. I see, I have the source for you, so I'm just going to scroll down so you can look at the Dvarim source. 1 second. Okay, here we go. So I'm not going to read it, but I'll summarize and you can, feel free to read on your own. So basically, we're told that, right, there will be no needy, right, in our verse, there'll be no needy among the people if they fulfill God's laws. Now, these laws may refer to the laws of the Shemitah year, right? If we forgive all debts in the Shemitah year, then we'll ensure that no one is needy. But that doesn't seem to be how Rabbi Yochanan and Ilfa are reading this line. They seem to be reading it out of context as being prescriptive, if not prophetic, right? God has promised that there will be no poor, and so they have to ensure that this promise is fulfilled. There's something a little bit maybe paradoxical about that, because the Torah says that if we heed God's words, right, then God pledges that there will be no poor people. So if so, why not just keep studying Torah and trust that God will provide in keeping with God's promise? So one of these two scholars is going to make that decision, but not quite yet. Okay, we'll come back to Zarian, but I'm going to go back to our story, the second part. Okay. They went and sat under a dilapidated wall, Gudaria, and were eating bread when two ministering angels arrived. Rabbi Yochanan heard that one angel said to the other, "Let us knock this wall down upon them and kill them, as they abandon the eternal life of Torah study, Chayei Olam, and engage in temporal life, Chayei Sha'ah, for their own sustenance." The other angel said to him, "Leave them, as there is one of them whose time of achievement stands before him." Literally, like the hour stands for him. Tekaimale Shata, probably an astrological term. Okay, so they leave the Beit Midrash, right? They go eat bread. They sit under an unsound wall and they eat bread. And both of these elements are a little bit surprising. Okay, so why sit under an unstable wall? Earlier on the same daf, the Gemara quoted Rabbi Yanai as saying, "Le'olam al ya'amod adam b'makom sakana v'yomar osin li nes, shema ein osin lo nes," right? A person should never put themselves in a place of danger and say, "Oh, a miracle is going to happen. God's going to save me." How do you know? How can you have that overweening confidence that God is going to save you? You can't know, right? We talk about humility as a major theme in this Masechet, right? There's some hubris in saying like, "Oh, whatever, I'll be fine if I sit under this unstable wall." Okay, and of course also the bread is a little bit surprising because they're supposed to be completely destitute. Where's the bread coming from? So the unstable wall, it's very puzzling. Perhaps we're meant to conclude that for them, only the walls of the Beit Midrash can guarantee stability, whereas everything outside the Beit Midrash is prone to collapse. Perhaps they feel that the moment they leave the Beit Midrash, the world is falling in on them. I would argue furthermore that given that the Talmud was created on the ruins of the destroyed Beit HaMikdash, we can read the entire Talmud as a sort of post-traumatic response to the Churban, such that every collapsing building and structure, and there are several of them in the third parak of Taanit, that's why our story is here, because we're discussing, what are the things we fast for? Well, if there's a collapsing building, a collapsing wall, an avalanche, right? That's one of the things that comes up in the third parak. That every building, every unstable building, every unstable structure is also, in a sense, a ruined Beit HaMikdash. This makes sense, I think, if we consider that one possible intertext for our story, if you believe, as I have come to believe, that so many of the Agadot in the Talmud are set against the backdrop of biblical narratives, which the rabbis rework and imagine. I think sometimes it is almost like, Chazal, they knew all Mikra by heart, and they were always learning Torah, and, sometimes they'd fall asleep, rabbis, like Niyim Velo Niyim, they often fall asleep in the Beit Midrash. It happens fairly often, like is one rabbi sleeping or not sleeping? Is he just testing a student? Anyway, imagine sometimes it's like the rabbis fall asleep with a particular story that they're learning and they've collapsed on the book. And then they have these wild dreams, in which they're sort of developing the whatever biblical story they're learning. And that's how we get the Agadah. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps one intertext for our story is the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, when Yaakov leaves the security of his father's house in Beersheba, where his situation has become untenable thanks to his brother Esav, and he sets out for all the unknowns of Haran. Why do I say this is an intertext? Well, according to the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, Yaakov is in fact leaving the Beit Midrash of Shem and Aver, where he's just spent 14 years learning. The Midrash teaches that when the Torah says, Vayikatz Yaakov Mishnato, that Yaakov awoke from his sleep, we may also read it as Vayikatz Yaakov Mi Mishnato, that Yaakov was roused from the world of Mishnah, from the world of learning that he had been immersed in for so long. Yaakov, like Ilfa and like Rabbi Yochanan, leaves the secure world of the Beit Midrash behind and encounters angelic presences en route to his new life. Moreover, Yaakov takes a vow when he wakes up from his dream, Im yeh Elokim imadi, ushmarani b'derech asher shenolech, v'natan li lechem lechol, right? If God, you will give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, vows Yaakov, which is presumably Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan's concern as well, as they sit there eating what little bread they have. How will they provide for themselves given how destitute they are? What is this unknown world that awaits them outside the Beit Midrash as they wake up mimishnatam? Now the story begins to take a bit of a supernatural turn with the introduction of the two ministering angels. Why do these angels arrive? Are they meant to accompany each of these men on their journey, like the angels ascending and descending the ladder when Yaakov sets out for Haran? The first angel suggests killing the sages as punishment for leaving the Beit Midrash, but the other angel rises to their defense on account of the fact that one of the sage is destined for greatness. And I'll go back to our story and I'll read section 3. Okay, so this conversation among the angels, Rabbi Yochanan heard all this, but Ilfa did not hear the angels' conversation. Rabbi Yochanan said to Ilfa, did the master hear anything, right? Ilfa said to him, no. Rabbi Yochanan said to himself, since I heard the angels and Ilfa did not hear, I can learn from this that it is I whose time of achievement stands before me. In other words, the angels were talking about me. Rabbi Yochanan said to Ilfa, I will return home and fulfill with regard to myself the contrary verse, Ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. Here we have a masterful use of dramatic irony. We have been privy to the angels' conversation, but one of the sages has not. Rabbi Yochanan overhears this conversation among the angels, and presumably he thinks to himself, wait, is it me? Am I the one destined for greatness? Right? And the best way to check is to check in with Ilfa. Ilfa hasn't heard, so Rabbi Yochanan concludes it must be he. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan's continued attunement to the eternal realm is evidence that he remains ambivalent about having left this life, whereas Ilfa has moved on. Rabbi Yochanan explains his decision to Ilfa, justifying it by invoking a biblical verse that appears just 7 psukim later in that same parak in Dvarim, Ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. Now I want to go back to Dvarim for a minute because when we've now quoted 2 psukim from Dvarim and we very conveniently skipped over 7 psukim in between. And if you look at the 7 psukim that we've skipped over, I'll just read a little bit to you, right? I'm not crazy. Okay. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites, it sounds better in Hebrew because it's like from one of your brothers, right? From a person you're very close to, right? In any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving to you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. And don't think, I'm going to paraphrase, don't think because the Shemitah year is coming and debts will be forgiven, this is not a good time to make a loan, right? Apropos of the class about Tikkun Olam, anyone's nice intertext. But anyway, right? Don't think, oh, this is a bad time to make a loan. You have to give generously, right? Don't begrudge your fellow, your brother. There will always be poor in the land, and you're obligated to help out the poor. And I really view these psukim. I didn't think of this before, learning now this whole Masechet, and seeing how much the theme of solidarity and really supporting those around you who are in distress, although you may not be in distress, is a big theme of this Masechet. We saw it a lot in this parak, in the third parak, right? Right? If one city has pestilence or whatever, and has something bad happen to it, but one town does, but your town is nearby and you're not affected by this. Well, do you have to also fast? Do you have to also blow the shofar, right? Right? We saw that come up a few times in the Mishnah, right? Like, to what extent do you have to show solidarity for those who are suffering? in a way, what Rabbi Yochanan is doing, right? In conveniently skipping over these 7 verses, which speak of the importance of not forsaking one's brother, giving him whatever he is lacking, Rabbi Yochanan is kind of making a selfish decision here. He's saying, okay, if one of us is destined for greatness, it's clearly me. And where is greatness to be found if not in the world of Torah learning? And so he decides he's going to head back to the Beit Midrash. Now, I want to note here that the different life choices that each of these sages make is not without precedent. Over 100 years earlier, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai engaged in a similar debate about this very question of how to balance work and Torah. Their debate appears in the 6th chapter of Masechet Brachot, in which both sages are struggling with a pasuk from Dvarim, different pasuk from Dvarim, from the 2nd paragraph of the Shema, where we're told that if we obey God's commandments, then God will cause the rain to fall, the land will yield its bounty, the people will gather in new grain every year. Let me just show you here. I have the sugya here. Okay, it's Bavli Brachot. It's in Brachot Lamed Hamud Bet. Okay, you have it on your source sheet now, source 3. It should be in front of you. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize, but again, you have it in front of you, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just paraphrase, okay? So if people obey God's words, then God will cause the rain to fall and the people will gather in new grain every year. But how can the people be bothered to gather in new grain every year, right? After all, as we learn in Sefer Yehoshua, right? Here. Okay, so basically, right? You're supposed to gather in new grain, and Rabbi Yishmael says, yes, you are supposed to gather in new grain. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to learn Torah. I'll just read in section 1. Should this be taken here? Our sages taught you shall gather in new grain. What does this teach? What does this teach? Because it says, Lo yamush sefer haTorah hazem mipicha. Okay, you're supposed to always have Torah in your lips. V'gita bo yomam v'layla. You're supposed to be learning Torah all the time. Should this be taken literally? It teaches you're supposed to gather in the grain. How can you be at once gathering in your grain, performing agricultural labor and studying Torah all the time? Rabbi Yishmael says, perform worldly occupations together with them. That is to say, combine Torah and your work, make them, do both. Section 2, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, is it possible that a man plow in the plowing season, sow in the sowing season, harvest in the harvest season, thresh in the threshing season, winnow when the wind blows? Right? Agricultural work is a full-time job. You don't get a break, right? You're always out there in the fields. Then what will become of Torah? Torah matehei aleha. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, I don't get it, right? We're supposed to study Torah all the time. How is that possibly compatible with gathering in grain, with all the agricultural labor we're supposed to do? What is the solution? When Israel fulfills the will of God, their work is done by others. As it is said, strangers shall stand and pasture your flocks. When they do not fulfill the word of God, then their work is done by themselves. As it is said, you shall gather in new grain. Okay, so basically, right, we have these two opposite opinions, right? In a way, right, you have Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, which is like Ilfa's view of like, okay, I'm going to find a way I have to go make a living, right? I have to do my agricultural work or whatever it is the work I need to do, as opposed to Rashbi, who says, no, right? I'm going to do God's will and God will provide, right? Strangers will stand in and pasture my flocks. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan, right, follows the opinion of Rashbi, who says, right, Torah matehei aleha, whereas Rabbi Yishmael is concerned about what will happen to the individual who may potentially go broke. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is concerned about what will become of Torah. He doesn't worry that the Torah scholar will go broke because he's confident that God will provide. The sugya in Brachot ends with a cautionary tale from Abaye. I'll just read this. Abaye said, many acted in accordance with Rabbi Yishmael and prospered. In accordance with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, many also acted and they did not prosper. That is to say, those who followed Rabbi Yishmael's advice generally met with success, whereas those who followed Rashbi's advice did not. This makes sense, especially when we consider that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, right, he's the rabbi who famously hid in a cave with his son for 12 years studying Torah, entirely unconcerned about worldly pursuits. He uses the same terms, Chai Olam and Chai Isha, to justify his decision to stay in the cave and then to explain what happens when he leaves the cave. He stays there until he hears the voice of Elijah summoning him out. He doesn't have to worry about making a living because God provides for him a carob tree, a spring of water that miraculously supply all his nutritional needs. Bar Yochai had the experience of studying Torah to the exclusion of all else, and he's convinced that this is the way to go. But as Abaye warns, not everyone is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Not everyone merits to hear these heavenly voices. Ilfa, as we know, did not. Indeed, at least one source suggests that Rabbi Yochanan had an element of Rashbi's very radical devotion to studying Torah to the exclusion of all worldly pursuits. And I'll read you it's source 5. It's from Shir Shrim Rabbah. I think you can't really appreciate this source in English. So what I'm going to do is I think I'll just read it and follow along if you wish in the English so that you can hear it, okay? But you can read it in English, I'll read it in Hebrew, okay? Rabbi Yochanan, hava mitayel, v'salek mitveria letzipori, v'hava Rabbi Chia bar Abba samechle. Miton chad beit chakla, amar Rabbi Yochanan, hadin beit chakla havat didi, v'zabin te begin mile doraita. Miton chad beit kerem, ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan, hadin beit kerem didi hava, v'zabin te begin mile doraita. Miton chad beit zeta, ve'amar kmochen. Shari Rabbi Chia bar Abba, bachei. Amar le, ma'at bachei. Amar le, bachei ana, dilat shvakt l'sibuchei klum. Amar lo, Chia b'nei, unekala zo be'einecha ma she'asiti, shemacharti davar shenitan l'shisha yamim, shene'emar ki sheshet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Aval haTorah nitna la'arba'im yom, shene'emar vayisham im Hashem arba'im yom, right, describing Moshe and Sinai, lechem lo achal, right, okay, Uchti va'isha bahar arba'im yom, kadmach Rabbi Yochanan, hayadoro korei alav, and here's the connection to Shir Hashirim, im yitain ishet kol hon beito b'yahava, shehav Rabbi Yochanan et HaTorah, boz yavuzu lo. Okay, so the idea is, right, Rabbi Yochanan, right, everything, all physical things, all property, all material things, right, he was willing to just give up for the sake of studying Torah. And the competition between Torah and any worldly pursuit, Torah always won out for Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Well, everything in the world was created in 6 days, but the giving of Torah, well, that was 40 days. Clearly, Torah is more significant and more momentous than, right? Im lo nitna Torah lo yikaimu shamayim v'aretz. I think we saw that even in Taanit, or Gadol Yom HaGshamim ki Yom Shenitna Bo Torah, right? We know that Torah is, right, of course, paramount for Chazal. And here we see it for Rabbi Yochanan to the extreme. Okay, so let's go back to our story. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside, but we're gonna get to the end of our story. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan goes back to the Beit Midrash, right, justifying himself using this pasuk from Dream. Okay, section 4. Where am I? Okay. Rabbi Yochanan returned to the Beit Midrash, and Ilfa did not return, but went to engage in business instead. By the time that Ilfa came back from his travels, Rabbi Yochanan had been appointed head of the Beit Midrash, and his financial situation had improved. His student said to Ilfa, if Master had sat and studied instead of going off on his business ventures, wouldn't the Master have been appointed the head of the academy? Okay, and we don't know how Ilfa feels about being abandoned by Rabbi Yochanan, but it's hard to imagine that he wasn't distressed when he returned to this kind of welcome. Sure enough, Rabbi Yochanan has been appointed the head of the academy, suggesting that he was right in the conclusions that he drew. In any case, when Ilfa later realizes what happens, he becomes distressed, if not angry. After all, while the decision to leave the Beit Midrash was a joint one, it was only Ilfa who completely disconnected to such an extent that he could no longer overhear the heavenly conversation. Rabbi Yochanan remained with one foot or one ear still in the door, and he returned shortly thereafter. Perhaps Ilfa feels betrayed by his colleague's lack of solidarity, his colleague who forsook the temporal life they had both committed themselves to pursuing. And we find that he gets driven to desperate measures, and I will read. Ilfa went and suspended himself from the mast of a ship, saying, If there is anyone who can ask me a question concerning a Baraita of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yoshaya, and I cannot resolve his problem from a Mishnah, then I will fall from the mast of this ship and be drowned, okay? Ilfa seems desperate to prove that in spite of having engaged in commerce all those years, he still remains learned in Torah. He may not be the one who studied in the Beit Midrash all those years and became the head of the academy, but he's no ignoramus. Perhaps he's also reacting to a statement by Rabbi Yochanan, a statement Rabbi Yochanan made elsewhere in the Talmud in Eruvin, in which Rabbi Yochanan insists that those who engage in commerce cannot possibly be learned in Torah. I'll just read that here, source 4. Rabbi Yochanan said, Lo b'shamayim hi, what does that mean? Lo timsa b'gasei ruach. You're not going to find Torah in those who are haughty. V'lo me'ever layam hi, and Torah is not across the sea. Lo timatzei lo b'sachranim v'lo b'tagarim. Right? You're not going to find Torah among business people, traveling businessmen, or peddlers. Those are not people who could ever be learning in Torah. Meaning, Torah is not in the heavens, meaning you can't raise yourself up to the high heavens and think you'll know a lot of Torah. Torah requires humility, and Torah is not to be found who make their living traveling the seas. Ilfa is, in a way, guilty on both counts. He raises himself up to the mast of the ship, right? An image that recalls that the mast of the ship connecting heaven and earth, recalling the Sulam Yaakov also. And he boasts about how much Torah he knows. And he insists that in spite of devoting much of his adult life to sailing the seas, engaged in commercial pursuits, he is nonetheless well-versed in Torah. Read in the context of the source from Eruvin, Ilfa's challenge seems to be an attempt to pointedly refute Rabbi Yochanan's claims about who does and does not have the capacity to study and retain Torah. Now, we're not going to look at that. I think I'm not going to read the specifics of the challenge that is posed to Ilfa as he stands there on the ship and says, can anyone name a Braita, and I'll be able to show you the Mishnah that says the same thing. I want to think with you for a moment about, I'll just say in brief, right? The nature of the challenge that's posed to him, right? It's the old man comes in and poses a challenge to him, and it's about the case of a father who deposits money with a third party for the support of his children, and he gives that third party instructions as to how to distribute the money. So the legal discussion is about providing for those in need, continuing the theme of poverty with which the story began, and the verses from Dvarim, which we saw. Ilfa, true to his word, is able to associate this Braita with a Mishnaic statement attributed to Rabbi Meir. By Mishnah, he refers to what we think of as Mishnah, the collection of rabbinic teachings compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the early 3rd century. Those teachings that did not make it into the Mishnah were known as Braitot, from the Aramaic word bar, meaning outside. Braitot are rabbinic statements that were left on the cutting room floor after the Mishnah was compiled. Various rabbis had their own collections of Braitot, most famously Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yoshaya, who are cited here. And so essentially what Ilfa is saying is that for any teaching that seems to be only preserved in a Braita, he will be able to find a corresponding Mishnah. In other words, anything that you think is outside, says Ilfa, I will prove it's inside. What more fitting activity could we imagine for a scholar who's just spent the past several years of his life outside the Beit Midrash, but who wishes to prove that he still remains bound to everything that took place inside its walls? What I'm trying to say here is I think that Ilfa is also making a comment about himself. I, who you think of as outside, since I've been outside the Beit Midrash for the past few decades, I am actually still inside it. I am both Ilfa the ship and Ilfa the learner, encompassing both meanings of the Aramaic term. I have been outside the Beit Midrash, but I've never truly left it. And to prove it to you, I'm going to demonstrate my ability to link any Braita, anything outside, with something inside. I find Ilfa's challenge deeply moving to me personally as someone who's always trying to link what I am learning with what is happening to me in my life outside the Beit Midrash. Just a few days ago, I had an experience very similar where my children, we made s'mores for dinner and they were really delicious. And of course, we happened to have some leftover marshmallows and chocolate and you know, those biscuits in the pantry. And the next day, my daughter came home from school and she opened the pantry and said, looked at all these supplies and said, wow, Ima, those s'mores were so delicious. And I thought to myself, yep, That's the difference between Mazkirin and Shoalim. She knows that if she says, can we have more s'mores? I'll say, what do you mean? We didn't have dinner yet, s'mores. But she's like, oh, Mazkirin, it's not the right now, but anyway. So that is to say, I feel like I'm constantly making these connections between the outside and the inside. And in keeping with that spirit, I want to conclude with a source from the end of Masechet Kiddushin, which I will put on the screen. Our last source, in which Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar laments that he has to make a living. Why does he have to work? Why should he have to work? It's not fair, he says. The animals don't work. None of the animals have to support themselves. Why should he? And he realizes, oh, well, okay, I know why. It's because of, Chet of Adam Rishon, who, sinned in Gan Eden, and therefore, B'zayat Apecha Tocha Lechem, right? This is the curse of Genesis. Anyway, I'll just read it quickly. I'll read it in English, okay? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, okay, this is his lament. I never saw a deer work as one who dries figs, nor did I ever see a lion work as a porter, nor a fox work as a storekeeper. And yet they earn their livelihood without anguish, right? These animals have what to eat without working. But all these animals were created only to serve me. And I was created to serve the one who formed me. If these who were created only to serve me earn their livelihood without anguish, then is it not right that I, who was created to serve the one who formed me, should earn my livelihood without anguish? But I have committed evil actions and I have lost my livelihood, as it is stated. Your iniquities have turned away these things and your sins have held back from you. From Yirmiyahu. It is taught, Rabbi Nehorai said, I would set aside all the trades in the world and teach my son only Torah. That's Never mind. As all other trades serve one only in the days of his youth. But in the days of his old age, behold, he's left to lie in hunger, right? Most people have to retire at some point, right? And you can't do your job anymore. But Torah is not like this. It serves a person in the time of his youth and provides with him with a future and hope in the time of his old age. With regard to the time of his youth, what does it say? Kovei Hashem yachlifu choach. With regard to the time of his old age, what does it say? They shall bring forth fruit in old age and shall be full of sap and richness. This story gives voice to one ideal in our tradition, but I think that the story of Ilfa is a reminder that there's a tremendous amount of learning that can happen when we're engaged in other pursuits. To show that, I wrote a sonnet about this sugya. I have a love of poetry that comes from the world of outside the Beit Midrash, but I love to bring it into the world of Beit Midrash, so I'll just read it. It's a Shakespearean sonnet. Shimon ben Elazar said, no such thing is there as deer that take out figs to dry. No heavy burden bears the lion king. No cunning fox sells goods for man to buy. Nay, only man doth plow and till and hoe, and work from dawn to dusk just to afford his food. Though beasts serve man, they do not know of toil. Why must man who serves the Lord? For labor is man's punishment for sin. Nehorai thought, well, that's a rotten lot. I'd give up every job I traded in and train my son in Torah. Heck, why not? A job may serve a young man when he's spry, but Torah gives old men the wings to fly. Okay, Yachlifu Iver Kanasharim. From Ilfa, we can learn that there are many ways to live a life of Torah learning. Ilfa's challenge on the ship speaks to those of us who do not spend all of our days immersed in the Beit Midrash, which I think is true of most of us Daf Yomi learners. We're Ilfas, not Rabbi Yochanan's. We're not spending all our days in the Beit Midrash. Rather, the challenge we have set for ourselves is how to carve out time each day to learn some Torah amidst everything else we have going on in our personal and professional lives. Ilfa's challenge from the ship is in the same spirit as a lunchtime Torah class at a major law firm downtown, or a 6 a.m. Daf Yomi shir on a commuter train. Ilfa found ways to integrate Torah into his life, and all those non-professional Jews among us would do well to learn from his example. What makes the study of Torah so meaningful for me is the search for those connections between Torah and the rest of my learning, thinking, and living. How do the rabbinic sources I study in the Beit Midrash speak to the Shakespearean sonnets I love to read? How does the novel I'm in the middle of reading speak to the sugya I'm learning, or the book that my daughter pulls off the shelf in the library? How does the parsha inform a challenge I'm facing in my family life? This is the challenge that Ilfa sets for himself. He stands at the top of a ship, far adrift from the world of the Beit Midrash, and he's able to demonstrate that the sea he is sailing in is nonetheless Yam HaHalacha, the sea of Halacha and the sea of Torah. May we all merit to follow his example. Thank you.